Welcome to Renaissance Charge videos and Alathian Heart videos. And I'm Rick Friedrich. Today we're going to talk about the gains outside of the death circle. And so we're continuing on the series on informal fallacies sooner than I thought. And I wanted to actually show something else, and then I thought, well, I might as well combine the two objectives to make it maximum efficiency. So we want to do three examples. The main one is what most of you are looking for in my videos, which has to do with electrical systems and certain nonlinear processes. So we're going to start with that one first, and then we're going to get into some other ones more briefly at the very end. That will be, one is to do with religion, although this is really all religion in one way or another. So we're going to look at this first example with Professor Walter Lewin and Kirchhoff laws in specific detail, but without all the math. So we're going to look at circle reasoning, which we've been doing for several years in the whole loving path, selfish circuits loving path. So this will probably be an extension of that series. And so we're going to look at briefly the argument, the informal fallacies, what we talked about. Informal fallacies are not necessarily to do with the form of the argument, but the way the argument is presented, or the non-formal elements in it. And these are very common. You see them every day if you're around people, and you have to know these things to properly process truth against the prospect of error, and your own error. It's very important to overcome your own weaknesses in this respect. So the second one, the first one we've already dealt with, which is really, I should have said this more. The first example was really encompassing all fallacies of missing the point, and so that was kind of obvious in it, but like I said, these more or less overlap each other, these fallacies, but we tend to use them in a specific way, or classify them in a specific way. So we're going to look at the circle reasoning, and it's kind of begging the question is also a form of it, but we're just looking at the bigger idea of just a circle reasoning, and we're going to look at a circle circuit, which seems to be the definition of a circuit. And so we're going to look at that whole concept of arguing in a circle and limiting ourselves to words and definitions rather than in really covering what's real in reality. The whole concept of reality. So circulus in probando, circle in proving. Circular reasoning is a logical fallacy in which the proposition is supported by the premises, which is supported by the proposition, creating a circle in reasoning where no useful information is being shared. It's like a tautology where you're defining it by the words you're using to, you're not giving any substance to the, or information about it. So if you start off with your conclusion in your argument at the beginning, then really what have you accomplished? You're just basically saying it's true because I say it's true. It's true because it's true. Well, all right, but we're here to find out why is that, well, it's because it's true. And this is what you find over and over with people in so many different areas of life. And you just can't get past that because they can't understand basic reasoning. And you can't appeal to that because for whatever reason they'll keep saying the same thing. And if they say it enough, it's got to be true. Or you'll leave them alone. Or whatever. The fact is, what we're going to get into is the fact that people have been taught that way. And that's the major thing that I want to come against. Not so much the specifics here. It's like I've always said, the method is far more important than the content. Because if you have a faulty method, everything you're going to do is compromised. So while the content may be important, don't get past the method. Without the rules of the game, without the sincerity of the heart, it doesn't really matter what you speculate about, what you ramble with your lips. It doesn't really matter what you do in life. If you are not honest and sincere, what does it matter? So the method is everything, without which a wrong method is absolutely destructive. So that's where me as the philosopher comes in and tries to get to the foundation. That's what I'm doing these next 2 years, really focusing on foundational things. And while I'm not doing this from ground up here, this is just one thing pertaining to things that I'm dealing with right now with people, and kind of in concert with the various videos I've done recently and even over the last 3 years. So the problem with trying to argue with math students about the real world using math is circular and mostly pointless. Ooh, that's going to get people riled up. Now, I guess most of my listeners won't have a problem with that statement. Those of us in the real world, not in the virtual world or imaginary world or numbers world that we can create our reality. So anyway, such people can insist upon their math being true and ignore the real world. This is so often the case. It's not just math, it's just holding to a dogma in which has become so gripping on an individual that they can't see, sometimes they can't even see anything else. That's all they're about. Or it's so blinding that they can't see anything else. Or they're so blinding that they can't imagine anything contrary to it. And so they have this constant analysis of everything underneath that primary idea, in which case is math. So as we deal with Walter Lewin and his controversy on the subject of Kirchhoff's laws, or rules, I should say, we find that it's a losing argument from his angle. While he did do a demonstration, I feel it needs more enlarged demonstration, which is what I've done, and to remove away people from the tricks that they play with mathematics and meters and constantly finding an excuse for not accepting something. So that's in the world of the electrical sciences, just like the theological world, just like the political world. You have these games that you can never win in because you have somebody who's skilled in diverting the subjects into all these fallacies. And so you have to pinpoint them down or be thorough and walk through the whole thing, which is rather complicated in that method that Lewin was going at. So I am on the other end. I'm not a physicist. I'm not going to go that route. And I'm not going to ignore it, but I'm not going to address that right here. So even in the face of actual demonstration, people can find a way to disprove what has been shown. It's not within my ability or interest to wrangle about words and numbers, but in my work to merely do that which is practical and beneficial to humanity. Right? I'm not interested in debate. I'm not interested in the wrong sense of the term. Definitely dialogue, healthy debate is very important. But I'm not interested in proving a theory of my own or disproving somebody else's theory. I'm looking for, I'm not a pragmatist, but I'm looking for a beneficial outcome, towards the good of mankind. And it seems that, the students are so trained to be prejudiced, which is what I'm focusing on in this video, that they're not trained to be moral and upright and kind and loving, and they value self-interest, and they're taught self-interest above all else. And so people are in it for the argument's sake. People are in it blindly selecting their own reality, because that is the prevailing dogma, instruction method. That's the prevailing method in our day, is to be promoting self-interest at all costs, promoting party at all costs, promoting theory, belief, club, family above all cost. And all of these things are essentially evil. So then, commercial interests in the form of promoting and preserving slavery lead the masses to adopt various beliefs maintained by the circle fallacy of believing what one is taught and merely repeating that in both your premises and conclusions. So again, the slavery is gripping all of humanity directly and indirectly. And that is more or less obvious. And it's something that we can all agree happened in the past. Whatever age you can think of. So we are not above that. We are a more sophisticated version of the slave trade today. Such victim students make up the masses of humanity, which results in a massive pressure not to contradict prevailing views on the subjects. So I'm a victim, just like you are, of how we were brought up by examples all around us, but by the teaching methods of all of our teachers. We may remember some teachers that veered from that slightly, or very rarely completely. They can't even be in the system without being swallowed up very quickly. And this is an example where Lewin must have been very close to the line of, while he was at MIT, being swallowed up. And I can remember a few teachers that encouraged me to think. And they were quite different people than the rest of them, that really took interest in you as an individual, and as such encouraged true integrity. So think about that. Think about people. We have this Me Too movement. We have all these victim. Well, you got to see everybody as a victim. And that really will help in how you talk to people, because really, are you after helping somebody on an issue, or are you after helping them fundamentally? Because they're a victim fundamentally in the system itself. And the system is not merely it's not about a country, it's not about being a part of a club or members of whatever. It's about being human. And in the human race, in our present existence, we have people who are taught and encouraged to be selfish. And there's only two ways to go: to be absolutely selfish or absolutely honest and loving. There's no in between. So people don't believe it's possible to be absolutely loving and unselfish. But that's the only two choices. You can't be mixed. You're either one or the other. You're absolutely sincere or you're absolutely not. This is not an extreme statement. It's just a matter of fact. And so you're either encouraged one way or the other. And like I said, most people don't even fathom the idea that you could be anything but selfish. But that is the whole conspiracy of conspiracies, of which most conspiracy theorists are still lost in the mix of all that and haven't even recognized that. And so they don't get it, that all real conspiracies at the heart of them are evil and encourage people to be evil. And they do evil things. So let's get deeper into this. Sometimes one person will break free of that vicious circle loop of death, and they will become born again to the real world outside of the loop, where the sun shines freely upon the face of open hearts. It's kind of a little poetic statement there that I just wrote. And I'm not necessarily talking about being born again in the genuine biblical Christian sense of the term, but it is at least a parallel to that, where if you are locked in a loop and you can get out of that, like you think of a cult, you think of somebody imprisoned, they are stuck in a loop of existence which they cannot get free from. So when they come free of it, wow, there's more to reality than that. And this is the way we've got to look at this whole idea of a circular argument, is that you're stuck in a loop of your own choice. And there's various reasons for that you have to really come to grips with. So sometimes they can break free, and it's like a whole more, like somebody who is blind now can see, right? Suddenly they can see colors, they see depth, and just so much. And I have relatives that are colorblind, and they put on these special lenses, and they could see colors like they couldn't. You can see videos on YouTube of people doing that, and they just start crying because they're just so overwhelmed. And that's really the grace of God too, that when we come into the grace of God, it just brings us to tears, because there's so much more than what we assumed. Because we assumed evil, we assumed the worst, and we didn't understand until we experienced that. So prejudice in the form of circular assumptions ignores all of reality, and is a method of reckless selection of that which justifies a preference of mere good to self. So when I say prejudice, I mean prejudgment, which again is a fact gathering that's selective to our own self-interest. We've talked about this again and again, but it's the most important problem that we have in our existence. So we have to look at it. Nobody else is really directly, foundationally talking about these things, or very few, if there are. And so we have to get to the bottom. So it ignores reality that doesn't consist with self-interest. It selects out, it picks confirmation bias we keep talking about. And sometimes it's a matter of the cognitive dissonance. You cannot accept this because it goes against something that seems so real to you, or you don't know how they fit together. They don't know how they consist together, so you block it out, right? And this is something that we've all experienced. We have to come to grips with it. So no evil exists without its commission. Every form of vice or sin is an example. You always have to do this. You cannot, I'm not talking about doing something by mistake. We're talking about guilt and moral guilt. You cannot do anything evil in the moral sense of the term and be culpable for it without having becoming prejudiced. And essentially, you're using a circular argument to do that. In other words, you have to do the circular part of your process is going to be doing a circular argument in which, for example, you're selecting. So there's a whole bunch of facts in this room, and I choose to ignore. But in choosing to ignore, I've made a circle. I've come to a conclusion. I've decided to come to the conclusion that I want is the circle in that case. It's not that the circular argument is the particulars about that. It's the fact that my method is circular. I've decided that I want reality to be what I want, and I'm gonna go out now and only find conclusions, the conclusion of what I started with. And I'm not going to consider anything else. It's a little bit more involved in the bare circle reasoning, but it fits still. Naturally, the masses are trained to be assuming and selfishly selective so that they can be easily manipulated to serve the interests of the slave traders of every age. That's the way you got to think of it. There's all sorts of terminology people are using, but let's get back to the historical wording of slave traders, which we can all easily pinpoint by a casual look at history and say, oh yeah, there was slave traders doing this throughout history, right? Even recent history, people can come to grips with that. But once it gets closer to their times, they're not willing to really admit it. And that's the way it is. It's slave traders. But they've taught us, in control of the institutions, the religious, political, educational, the entertainment, goes on and on. All institutions and forms of influence have been possessed and controlled by special interests who train the masses to be selfishly selected and dumbed down. So keeping people in a state where they can't think properly, honestly, is what they have always done throughout history and continue to do. Now we have it very sophisticated because we have a whole system that sounds professional. There's a lot of work that you have to go through to become useless person. That you can only do something or a few things in your special field, but you have been duped because you have come to a place where you don't know how to do very much else, and you can't even realize that you've missed the mark fundamentally in life because you've been trained in a way that you think is prestigious, to become prestigious as an individual. You've been trained to become something that is looked upon as a professional. Your professionality is not real. It's a whitewashed tomb, as Jesus would say. You know, you have this tomb that looks all polished on the outside, but inside is dead man's bones, because you haven't even realized that you have missed the point. And this video is going to cover some examples of that, where it's ridiculous, the fact that we can go through years of training and miss the very first points, the very foundation, and then come to all sorts of misleading conclusions as a result. So this is how we've been manipulated in a very sophisticated way. In the past, it was more easy to identify that, but this whole taking over the institutions has been around for a long time, and has created the idea of the professional who's to be believed as an authority, contrary to any kind of, who's above any accountability, contrary to reality. So you cannot contradict that authority, because it's not based upon truth, it's based upon might is right. We have the power to declare, to dictate what you're to believe and talk about. Otherwise, you will face the consequences. And I'm telling you, if you're not facing the consequences in your life, it's because you're not in the truth yourself. And that's just the way history has always unfolded, that those who walk the narrow road of truth will suffer persecution. And I mean, there's ups and downs in that, but it's going to happen. If you're all, as John says in 1 John, if the world loves its own, you know, and it spits out those who contradict. So much effort is put forth to prevent true, independent, honest, thorough reasoning and living. Such action is outside the entropy loop and must be proclaimed to be the enemy of all that is normal and right. The entropy loop, everything's fading out, everything is deteriorating. This is the way people look at electronics. This is the way they look at moral character in the churches. All this is wrong. But that must be stopped. They say for somebody to go against that, how can they be? How can that be? It's not possible. Can't break free of that. Well, says who? Says who? Can you actually prove that you can't do that? No, you can't prove it. Because it would assume that you know all things in existence. And that's the dogma of the professional today. True love, on the other hand, true love in heart goes outside of the selfish loop of worldly existence and is the greatest threat to its existence and merchandise. So the selfish loop, slave traders promoting the same selfish heart, which is ultimately the devil wants to contradict God and trying to get everybody else to follow his heart is ultimately his goal. Not merely just to destroy people, but to create masses of people that he can say, see, the whole world is selfish and I have an excuse for being selfish. And this, once in a while, somebody can break outside that loop. But the goal of the selfish slave trader is to keep people selfish, or at least control those who aren't in such a way that they're minimized. God is outside that morally insane loop. It's moral insanity to be selfish. It's actually moral insanity. Not talking about mental insanity, moral insanity. And God is outside that loop and offers all to share in his infinite riches in another loving path. Right? So we're going to look at this loop again and look at the idea of a loving path and think about God's grace is outside that death loop. And the masses are blinded in a selfish death loop of which, upon looking upon each other, we feel like that's got to be all that there can be. Everything, the is fallacies, everything that we see, we assume to be the limit. Like I've said, you go to a place where young children grow up in an area where all the people are the same color, and they assume that everybody's that color. And when they see somebody white, or if they see somebody dark, the little kid goes, what's going on? What's wrong with them? You know, and that's the way it is, morally speaking. We just think that, you know, of course we have words that we read and that say otherwise, but practically speaking, if you don't see anybody who's living morally different than you, you assume that's all there is. Scientifically speaking, if that's all you've been working in, that's all you assume there to be possible. It's very hard to break free of the fundamental assumptions and the wrong ways of thinking. So let's go into our specific example here. Some preliminary words first. People who believe Kirchhoff's loop rule is a universal law in all circumstances have to assume that the path through which the motor circuit, in addition to the path through the battery loop. Okay, wait. I'm jumping into it too quickly for people to understand. Let me start off by introducing the circuit here. Is a closed loop circuit. And it's also a circle of reasoning. So I'm going to constantly make the analogy that I just made in this whole discussion. So here we have a battery or a source, in this case DC, positive on the top, negative on the bottom. And we're going to go through a resistor, and we're going to go through an inductor. And we're going to close the switch and open the switch. While the switch is closed, we have a loop. Now, when we have a closed loop like this, at some point, and that's a key word, key phrase, at some point, all the resistances in this circuit will come to a total that will be the same as the power. The same amount of power will all add up, and they will equal out. And I'm not going to get into all the specific laws because, or rules and explanations, or any kind of math in this video except for some very, very basic math. That's all you need to know here to experience this over time. If you're going to try and do an instantaneous experiment lasting very short period of time, that's where you're going to need to know all that math. And that's where the debate is wrongly focused, in my opinion. It's never going to conclude. You're always going to have two people who come to a conclusion that they already started with, two different types of people. And so I am saying we need to change that focus, like I've done over the last 15 years in the research that I've been doing with my motors. Before we look at the motors, I'm going to just talk about the fact that we're looking at this circuit here, and we're going to measure all the resistances, and they're going to add up, and that's when we're dealing with Kirchhoff's rule. It's going to be that way under certain circumstances only. So with that, let me go back and read what I have outlined here. I just don't want people to feel overwhelmed in this video at all, like they have to know some physics and understand all the mathematics. That's not the point of this video at all. So you can go into all that on your own time, or look it up, stop the video, and if you want to. So this rule, which is merely the case some of the time, but in the case of most people, they think that it's all of the time. So it's law in their mind. It applies all times, under all circumstances. You're always going to have the same energy that leaves the battery is going to be represented in the whole path of the circuit. There's not going to be any more or less. It's all accounted for. Let's say it that way. And so there can never be more or less in that. So you can account for the resistance in the wires, in the inductor, in the switch, and they all will eventually add up to what is coming out of the source. Sounds pretty reasonable. Until you get beyond that. Until we have something else. So let's look at that in a minute. So they have to assume that the paths through the motor circuit, or in this case, I'm going to talk about the motor circuit in a minute, the inductor, they have to assume, I probably should have wrote that part a little bit later. But I just kind of threw this together, so walk with me. To be a really effective video, I would have had to put this later and come to that point later. So that's all I'm saying. So they have to assume that the paths, well, I'm going to have to turn over to this one then to finish that sentence. So people who assume that Kirchhoff's rule applies, this is going to be my conclusion point. I'm not begging the question here, I'm just kind of outlining what I'm going to get into. They have to assume that this path and this path out here add up in the same way as this path does, is what I'm trying to say. That's my concluding point. And that's something that I haven't heard really explained so clearly. So that's why I'm doing this video, because I see that people are all focused in the wrong way. And we'll talk about that in a minute too, the specifics of what happened with the Lewin controversy. All right, so we have to consider, okay, well, it is assumed by making a mere rule a law that there cannot be a gain over that which is input into the circuit. That's the whole thing that's the controversy. It's perpetual motion. Of course, I did a video on that. If you say that you have more input or more output than the input in a circuit, it has to be perpetual motion. So what I talked about in the past video was that, hey, we're all in open loops, if you will, so it's not inconceivable that you can freely tap into the local environment, right? It just so happens that everything is always tapping into the local environment. So, but people don't see it that way. They don't realize it. They think very two-dimensionally, and they can't comprehend that. So it's not perpetual motion, which everybody actually believes in perpetual motion. It's not creating energy fundamentally like God created this creation. However it works is not the point of all these things, really. But what can we practically do? That should always be the underlying question, rather than what some law does or doesn't say. And therefore, I'm not even going to try to do something because I'm told that that's the limit of things. So again, it's making a mere rule a law, and that there cannot be a gain over what was put into the circuit. But the mistaken assumption is that they do not consider the self-changing magnetic field, right, relating to the inductor to result in becoming an additional source to the reversibly positioned load that is essentially a branched loop and not part of the current flow. So let's say that again. But the mistaken assumption is that they cannot even assume that this could become, this inductor somehow, whatever terminology you want to use in your physics books, that this inductor can actually become, in the process, time, not talking about instant or constant, we're talking about over time, from beginning to an end. That's the problem that people are not considering. Everything that happens from point A in time to point B, not just as if there was no time, right? They forget, or they don't consider, the inductor's self-changing magnetic field. Because we're not talking about that field changing from another external, for another external reason. We're talking about they were talking about pure conductivity, which we can have at resonance above radio frequency, which nobody's bothered to bring that up into the debate. But leaving that out, they're assuming in an ideal circumstances no environmental influences whatsoever. It's granted still that there's a changing magnetic field in that coil. Obviously, that's the most basic thing. But nobody's considering that changing magnetic field when they're applying these rules, these Kirchhoff's rules. They're not considering that changing magnetic field according to Faraday's law, which is the bigger universal true law of which this rule sometimes is in some circumstances it can exist. But the changing magnetic field has nothing to do with Kirchhoff's law or rule. It doesn't have anything to do with it, and that's the point that's missed. So in that, they do not realize the effect that this can have on the total energy produced by this circuit. All they want to do is ignore that inductor and essentially treat it like a resistor, or treat it like it's not even there and there's only the resistor in the circuit. I've removed the resistor. All the lines are resistances anyway, but I removed it for clarity's sake for what I want to say in a minute. But they want to just look at this as the same as this without, sorry, I'm jumping around here. Well, now I can open up the page. So let's go back and forth here. That would be better. They want to consider this or this as this in this way. They don't want to consider what's happening in the inductor, which then becomes an additional source of energy apart from the input. A negative, it becomes at some point a negative impedance in itself, only in relation to when there is a output for that to exist. Practically. I have to really carefully choose my words here, because if there is no practical benefit where it can manifest, then whatever you're doing up here when you close this loop and it works, it doesn't do, and it doesn't provide any additional output than what you'd have in the circuit. This is what I've talked about with my motors. You take a brushless fan motor in the back of your computer, inside of your computer, and it's run this way, essentially, and all you get is the magnetic benefit from energizing the coil. There's no other gain in the system. But when we add another battery, then the negative energy is the reverse flow, can charge another battery. And the total energy coming out of here is still used to run the motor in the same way, but now we have an excess of energy, and so it no longer, Kirchhoff's laws no longer apply when we look at not just this, but this plus this. I mean, this is so basic for any of you who have followed, but we need to look at it very clearly and see the mistake that people are making. And when I went through the videos of Lewin, I realized one specific thing that I need to add to this. So we're going to talk about that as we go over the videos. So now we have this load as a battery, becomes a negative resistance in relation to the primary circuit. So the primary circuit has a flow in this direction, and it loops back around, right? Now, that's the forward current, right? But when you have a battery that is oppositely positioned, so notice the polarity, this is negative on here. If this was positive, it would mean a world of difference, because this would flow through both the coil and the battery, but they're opposite position for a reason. So this becomes a negative resistance in which it is reversing the amount of energy from the input. When we calculate the input energy from the output energy at all points in the circuit, which is the resistance of the wires and the coil, and we measure them. Now this has to be done over time. It can't be done at one particular time, because you're going to find differences. But overall, over time, repeatedly, over days, months, years, which is what we've done, okay? That's a key point here. Don't lose sight of that. That we can collect energy, we can charge up a battery over time. So, I mean, this load as a battery or a capacitor becomes a negative resistance in relation to the primary circuit. So, because it's not doing this in series with the primary circuit loop, right? If I had it somehow in series, because it's not doing it in series but in parallel to it, and because it is charging in reverse direction to the primary current flow, right? It's charging this way, and the current flow is that way. Such people don't even consider it worth measuring or in violation to Kirchhoff's loop rule. And how many times? And I don't really get the skeptics coming anymore like Lewin is getting in the academic world, because I think in the academic world, students aren't taking it seriously anymore. It's kind of a failing. The institutions are all failing. All the religious institutions are failing, and the political ones, the educational ones, all these things are failing, and the younger generations are not really caring too much. The masses are waking up to some degree. So when I say that, kind of getting off topic, but well, when I was doing this some years ago, when I started getting into all this, there's a lot of skeptics coming at you just like, there's no way, blah, blah, blah. And I said, just build it, man, just do it. No, it can't possibly work, blah, it's not going to do anything. And then after going back and forth, he finally did it, and I can't believe it. It doesn't make sense. And they're really pulling their hair out. I remember some engineer one time when I was at the fair in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and I had my big wheels spinning, and I had the basic circuit, right? And you can see that the batteries are in series with each other. And this guy just was holding it in his hand. He picked up the frame where I had the circuit in, and he was just looking at it for probably 20 minutes. And he was speechless. Like, I could see the sarcasm in his face, but then the torture that he couldn't understand it, because he could see it running and literally charging up a battery. But all of his life, he would have been told this is insignificant. This is imaginary current. This is nothing here. Nothing here. Don't look there. Don't look there. It doesn't exist. These guys are quack people, perpetual motion, scam artists, which, believe me, there's plenty of those. And so I've had that experience with people from time to time where they just have this kind of crisis of realization. And so they don't think to look there because they're not considering that it could even do anything, but they just don't consider it at all. And in Lewin's case, he didn't show it being used. So it wasn't practical because he didn't make it practical. And I think he would have crossed a line, a very serious line, if he had done that. And I think he knows that. He knew it at the time, and he knows that if he actually went and made an application of it, that would have been it. He would have been fired, killed, whatever. I have no doubt about that. Under the circumstances that he did present it, he stayed within the boundaries of not going too far. And I look at that in a way which obviously sounds like I'm a conspiracy theorist by saying all that, but if we look at history, we can see that there was lines that were crossed and consequences followed. And I think what Lewin did was he merely opened the door and then didn't really complete all that he could have done. It's not really something that he should probably even risk his life for anyway. But the point is, he did it in such a way where now there's so many other people coming to contradict him that it has an overall effect of squashing the opposition, squashing his belief, his demonstration, by the sheer numbers of people who are devouring him in a sense. I mean, he's not devoured in a bad sense, but the fact is that when you look at the overwhelming response, people are just saying what they are, like he's doesn't know how to use probes because he never did anything practical with that. So I've been doing that for 15 years and showing everybody how to do that with the battery. And of course now we're way beyond the very basics of this and getting into a lot more advanced stuff, but we have to have this as the foundation to understand what's really happening here. And I've been trying to do that over the years, and as I get the time to reflect of how to present it, I add more videos and details. So again, if you just ignore what's happening in the inductor, then you're just going to assume what you're going to assume. So now think about this. While Lewin merely showed the reverse inductor voltage 9 times more than the forward voltage, I have shown batteries being charged this way for years. Now, I'll say this before I finish that thought, was you'll look at my description, all the links and information necessary, I'll put that in the description so you can follow the various videos that we'll be going over. And then you could probably watch this beginning part over again to hear my reasoning, which is more important than even the videos themselves, because I'm showing the rules here. But anyway, Lewin merely showed a spike of 9 times the volts than the forward voltage. 9 times more than the forward voltage. But I've shown this actually charging batteries significantly. All right? And I was starting out, I was going to just do video responses of some of these really, really cheesy, really sarcastic, condescending videos these guys are putting out, where they're trying to easily dismiss a fake free energy video, or you know, so they're using a straw man, which will be another day. We'll talk about straw men. So I actually probably do a video like that later on as an example of a straw man argument. You create a little straw man and you easily blow them down, right? So that's, now I don't need to do the video, I just explained it. Anyway, I'll get into another video one day going over that. And then I just thought, well, these people are operating in their demonstration at a primary level of thinking. I mean, we're talking about kindergarten level of reasoning and crying and being proud at the most youngest age of our existence. And that's the way these guys are operating. They have no dignity, no respect. They're just trying to put somebody down. And you know people by their fruit. It's just so irritating, you can't even watch it. But you can see that these people are not really knowing anything but the very basic understandings of electrical phenomena, from like learning about how to flip the light switch on and the light goes on, is essentially what they're arguing, and which is really what this whole Kirchhoff's law is, or rule is, trying to do. So anyway, at least the people that are arguing with Lewin are not usually insulting him too much. But I think ultimately their argument came down to saying that he was making mistakes with probes. I mean, I think of all people, he certainly knows how to use his probes and what they mean. And he backs up what he says in some journals that we'll look at in a minute, from and from the more advanced physics books. We'll talk about that in a minute. So now the primary battery, or the source to the circuit, the primary battery, okay, is the source of the energy in the circuit, and is in series. If it was in series with the charging battery, then they would be able to see, like if we could somehow put this in one loop, which we can't, because that's the whole reason why it can exist, because it's outside of the loop. But if we had this negative resistance, which is negative in relation to this positive, right? Because in a sense, these are all still in a closed loop together, right? There's no other input into the system other than from where the energy is actually really coming from. But for purposes of simplicity, we're just talking about this being in a closed box. So because this is the source of the current flow, and this is receiving benefit from that, in other words, nothing happens here, like this is not adding energy backwards as this one is adding energy forwards. This is the source, the total source of all that happens in everything here. But because this is not in series with it, so that as it charges up, you have negating the positive flow and still having the same amount of energy flowing across the inductor and resistors, the wires. So you'd have X amount of energy flowing, but then you'd have a negative component which would directly violate Kirchhoff's rule, because you would still have so much energy flowing out of here, you have this energy flowing out of here, and we see it across the loads, but this case it's a negative load. So now this negative load is reducing what this is actually putting out. So we have more loads across here, and indeed in the charging battery itself, than what we can account for. Where is it coming from? Now, if it was in series like that, then everybody would be like, oh, okay. But because it's over here, nobody wants to look at that. And that's the gist of what I'm really trying to point out here. So that was kind of going to the conclusion points first, and I should have wrote it differently. But so what Lewin points out is that if you merely use a voltmeter across the inductor, oh wait, hold on. Oh, okay. Before I get to what Lewin was saying, let's look at this more carefully. So if you look here, that this negative terminal is in series with this positive terminal. If this is a 12 volt battery and this is an equally 12 volt battery, and that they're of equal capacity, if this one is discharging and this one is charging, and you have a combined voltage of 24 volts, so say it's 13.5, let's just say it's, I'm sorry, not 13.5. If we do 26 volts to keep it, the battery's 12.5 volts, identical capacity, and this one's this one is 12.5 volts, this one's 12.5, and let's do our math, 26 volts, 25 volts, sorry, jumping around here too much. I can add up, I'm not that math illiterate. So if we have 12.5 volts plus 12.5 volts together from ground, from positive here to ground here, we're going to have 25 volts. Now, as this is running this load or resistance across whatever, and you can account for all the energy, which you can't really, but we'll just say for simplicity, you can count, if you could in your mind think that you're counting for all the energy in this loop here, and the voltages remain the same while the load continues. Now this is not this is doing this over time, pulsing, right? And you're adding up all the energy here. This is all self-contained. And over time, the voltages stay the same across both the batteries. So this goes down and this goes up. But nevertheless, you have the same voltage, 25 volts. Then you got a problem there, because now you're actually you're running these loads here for free. In this case, we're running a motor, which is a fan that is now running the same speed as it was before, but my voltages are the same. Now that's ideal, but it doesn't even have to be that good. In that case, we have no input in the sense of the total picture. It's self-sustaining in a way, at least for a time. There's no input into the system, but you have a constant output in the form of a load, of a mechanical load. And then you have the resistance considered as the losses still in the line. So that we've demonstrated for years and years and years. And just about any size. I mean, I had a 26-foot cabin cruiser, which I gave boat that I gave rides in, showing the basic system here. And so when you consider this side in addition to this side, then you can see it doesn't add up. So having said that, which is really should have been said afterwards, if we look at what Lewin points out is that if we look at the top circuit here, this is exactly what he was showing. So we have our source with its resistor, and the voltmeter is actually in its own series path. And this is the mistake that everybody was making. They weren't realizing that the voltmeter is its own loop with the circuit. So there's 3 loops here. Can you see them? It's like those Facebook questions. How many boxes can you see? How many boxes can you see here? Well, according to them, there's 3 boxes and they're only looking at 1. So what are the 3? There's a loop around here, and that's all they're really considering. And that's always constant current loop. There's no change in magnetic field in that loop, because they essentially have bypassed the inductors, whatever's happening to the inductor magnetically over time. This is the over time part that's the part that is the weak link of trying to do this, trying to carry out this debate is too problematic in the fact that there's so many changing things over the switch period. The time that you close the switch and you open the switch, and the time that you fully measure the one event is rather complicated. And that's not going to do the average person any good. It's never going to do any college student any good, because at the college level, they're still in diapers. Sorry to say that. And this is what Lewin is getting all flustered about, is that because just like basic chemistry, when you learn these basic ideas in high school, and you're still in your diapers, essentially, you start, at least in college, you start learning that this is not actually the way things are. So in chemistry, you start learning those things sooner. You have to get to the graduate level and beyond, the doctorate level in physics, to realize, like we're going to quote here, that Kirchhoff's rules are for the birds if you think they're a law. So Kirchhoff's law would be for the birds. Kirchhoff's rule is just for the kids in diapers, or those who have been educated and walked away from their college education with a limited understanding of reality and assume that's all there is to know. And you see that with a little child too. They learn something over their brothers or sisters and they're like, I know more than you. And they know everything, right? But that mentality, unless it's checked, continues on. And even after you finish college, if that's all the education you had, you assume that's all of reality. So, So this first box is not considering any changing magnetic field. And that I have to qualify more and more, but I don't want to take too much time with this video doing this, but this is the critical point. Now notice the voltmeter is a positive and a negative, right? It's measuring positive and it's a scope voltage reading. So it's not just merely a number on a multimeter here. We're talking about true RMS, looking on the scope, all the right equipment, right? Which has its own resistance, capacitance, and inductance as well. But that's all compensated in all the math, and that's not the issue. That's what they're trying to make into the issue, which is ridiculous because, again, there's no end to such deliberate skepticism, deliberate diversions. So, if this is positive and this is negative, then all you're going to see, if you don't allow the voltmeter to go negative, and you're only considering the positive, and you're only considering it at a certain time, Kirchhoff's law rule only pertains to a constant current, a stable, steady flow. And under that circumstance, it's true. It's always the case. Unless there's an outside influence, which then makes it not applicable, it is always the case. So he is saying that this loop here is always going to be the sum. It's going to always add up. If we ignore the inductor, which is where the voltmeter is, but that's why he can reverse it, and he can see at a different time another result. But that negative is not allowed in this calculation because they are arguing in a circle, setting the rules. And the point is that if we look at this over time, it's so obvious. That's why he's getting so upset, because he's saying it very clearly, and these guys are playing games. And they're playing college kid games. Some of them are not kids, and they should know better. And the other professors are just kind of hiding behind their students like this, like, let them make fools of themselves because we can't do that, you know. But I think this is coming out now, and hopefully this video can really help in that whole dialogue. I mean, this to me is just so long time ago we dealt with this. It's like so childish when we can demonstrate this and have been thousands of people all around the world. In fact, what Lewin is saying is that we would have nothing if their theory was true. We couldn't exist without that. All these processes in life, in the real world, are using this. And of course, that's another whole subject in itself. But anyway, so we have used other words for this than what Lewin was saying, in that he was saying reverse currents and stuff like that. We have used other words for this, but we've shown in the battery and other loads that this reversal phenomena does indeed result in substantial gains to the total sum. You know, the total sum is supposed to add up, and therefore there's an additional in addition to the sum. It's not a specific percentage, because that varies depending upon the rate of change and the size of the negative resistor. Those are the two major factors which I've been talking about recently in all these videos recently. But Kirchhoff has nothing to do with rate of change at all. Therefore, it's Faraday that we're dealing with. to talk in terms of Lewin, let's deal with the parent, the universal law, which is Faraday, and which Kirchhoff is only part of, a special case of, right? The problem is those stuck in the primary closed loop cannot get out of their single circle reasoning assumption. It's always like they're only going to tolerate an AC circuit back and forth. They're not going to tolerate a DC circuit reverse current, or whatever they want to call it, or whatever you want to call it. So they're only considering this forward flow, and what happens, they cannot consider that this becomes an open loop, a second body, as we called it in my resonance book, as multi-body, as Barrett talks about back in 91, which I've made a lot of reference to in the book. So this single body here, even in itself up here, because it's not being used where the voltmeter is as an output, I think they've all stumbled on that. But even as Lewin says, if you put the voltmeter in reverse and we see negative voltage, real negative voltage there's no mistake in the voltmeter. I mean, that is so childish. It's ridiculous. But because he doesn't have a load and he's not willing to talk about that, which is what they're really, I think, pushing for him to do, therefore they can keep saying this, and he can't really get beyond that because he's not showing any practical value in this whole circuit. That is a practical, people want a practical difference that they can tangibly see rather than abstract numbers on a meter. That's why I have not made so much focus on the mathematical side of things, because I really wanted to help people actually achieve a beneficial result in the real world rather than contradict some closed-minded theory. So they are simply saying there can only be one circle and we must ignore the reverse circle or any additional circuit. But they are insisting a priori, or beforehand, that only that which comes under Kirchhoff's rules can be considered a reality. They're just constantly reaffirming the conclusion again and again and again. This is one big circle reasoning that goes against demonstration in the real world. So now I've talked about this in the book that comes with the resonance kit. This is a single body, and this is a multi-body. This would be a single body example, and this is a multi-body example. So what people are used to is a single system with all the grounds tied together. You have either parallel or series resistances that flow in the same direction. They are not used to considering, except for problem solving, inductor reactances, or if they're dealing with resonance. they consider a multi-body system only in their calculations, and then once they get into the real world and they're designing circuits and for a company, if they assume Kirchhoff's law and no changing magnetic field, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. This is what you constantly find in the engineering world. Correct me if I'm wrong. I talk to engineers every day, all over the world. And so tell me that they're not spending all their time trying to deal with canceling out the excess energy from the inductor that is ruining their circuits, right? So they know about it. They're not willing to admit it because nobody's using that to an advantage. It's only a negative phenomenon. We got to get rid of it. Negative energy. It's negative psychologically in their minds. But actually, we're realists. We're not optimists. We're realists, fundamental, founded in reality, and we use it in a positive way to charge a battery, run a light, power a transformer, charge a capacitor. And so, but they can't, at the college level, where they're still in their math, they're not in the real world, they haven't eaten real food yet. And I say this as a rebuke because of the arrogance that these people come across. I say that because that's their level of reasoning. And I don't say that disrespectfully. I say that because, as a matter of fact, when you get into the real world, it's different than an idealistic mathematical equation where you're narrowly focused on an exception to the universal. You're still in a particular circumstance, and you've been put in this box. And this is the danger of being so stuck in a cult, stuck in a group where everybody thinks the same way, and they all smile at each other like, aren't we the greatest? And that's what it is. And I think enough kids see through that more and more now, and I think we're heading into a different day. So since my last video on this subject, with Lewin, there's been a lot of activity. So I did a video like a year ago or so on this, and it didn't really get much attention because I really didn't add anything significant to it. But I think this video is adding a very critical factor of pointing out the foundation, the methodology, looking at the big picture, and providing what Lewin is not providing is actual examples where we do this, and we have done this, and thousands of people have done this. And so it's like we've come back 100 years ago to that point where the people are still arguing that you can't fly. Mathematically, you cannot fly. And then they're starting to see more and more planes fly over their heads. And what are they going to do? Okay, well, they still can't fly the way I've been saying they can't fly. That's the kind of thing that happens. And these people kind of slowly shrink away. I mean, we're a long ways out before that's the case. But if you get high enough up in technology, you realize this is all a big joke. Nobody believes this who's working with nonlinear switching systems. They can't help but see all this, right? Believe me, I talk to the engineers in whatever field you name, and a lot of them become my customers and buying some of these things to kind of illustrate to their peers and other people, hey, yeah, this is what we've been seeing in our own field. And so it's just absolutely ridiculous. And there's so many things out there that are using these processes and showing these gains, not for maybe an energy device that creates excess energy, but to run various processes. And there's thousands of patents just on light processes alone that depend upon this. You know, so it's just ridiculous. So he's got this latest video about 4 months ago. To agree or not to agree, that is not the question. Is not the question. I thought that was an interesting title. And I have the link in the, I'll have the link in the information section of this video. And so here's what the quotes that I want to quote from that video. All right, so I could focus on a lot of things, but for me, the psychological part is most important, and which is the focus of this video, more than trying to prove whether this can be done or not. Because if we don't come down to why people are making the choices they're making, and figuring that out, then we're just at a stalemate. Like he said, agreeing or not agreeing is not the issue. And so I found some interesting points that he said here. Why is it that so many of you are religious, in a religious way, believe that Kirchhoff's loop rule always works? Why is it that you're just like, now I wouldn't use that word religious, because religious doesn't have to be prejudice. What it is he should have said fanatical, or prejudice, or incredulous. Why is this that so many of you in an incredulous way believe that Kirchhoff's loop rule always works? Would be better to say. There are two reasons for that. One is, in high school, the circuits that you learned in high school never dealt with magnetic flux changes in a way that I just described. Right? It's always a constant current resistor, and really the inductor is, you're not looking at, you're merely looking, when you're looking at an inductor, you're merely looking at the fact that it's resist change, and then it, as it, over time, it resists less and less, and then the current flows more and more until it doesn't resist anymore, and it becomes essentially a resistor. So in high school, you're never looking at what happens when it starts resisting. What could happen at that moment if you had some kind of load across it? They're never going to even focus on something like that. It's way too advanced. I mean, they called it the simplified schoolgirl circuit because a 10-year-old girl, well, she didn't actually even do that. But the schoolgirl circuit, which is kind of like, you know, I don't know how many countless people have won the science fair awards using my kits to confound their teachers and all their peers. And so they are never taught the flex changes and to really add up all the energy forwards and in reverse. It was only forward that they were considering. So now, okay, so what else he says? I never even had even Faraday's law in my high school at all, he said, Lewin. So in high school, all the circuits that you have are perfectly satisfied with Faraday's law because this is zero. So in other words, Kirchhoff's law is still, or rule is still part of, Kirchhoff's rule is part of Faraday. So they are all so satisfied with Kirchhoff's loop rule. So they teach you Kirchhoff's loop rule, and you remember that for the rest of your life. It's brainwashed into your system. You can never let it go. That is, no matter what I hear, to stop quoting him now, no matter what I hear people, whenever they present something, they always have to throw that out, or the implications of that. They always have to throw that belief out into their statement. They've just violated it, but they'll just have to reaffirm it, even though they've just violated it. No matter what happens, they have to state their main dogma of the religion. That's the first premise, is that this is a universal law that can't be violated. Because if it does, it has to somehow violate the laws of thermodynamics. It has to somehow create something that's impossible. So they always have to state this dogma again and again and again, and the more it's stated, the more it's believed. It's brainwashed into your system, he says. You can never let it go. So for you, many of you have a religious belief in Kirchhoff's loop rule. Later on he says, now we'll show you also why many of you also believe that Kirchhoff's loop rule always works. Because most college physics books say so. They have it wrong. It is embarrassing. It is immensely embarrassing, but I cannot change that. Later on he says, the reason I feel very bad about this is because these people who write these books have physics degrees, but they really don't understand Faraday's law, and what they sell you is utter nonsense. It's just wrong physics. It's bad. It's very bad. So these books persuade you that Kirchhoff's rule always works, and thank God it doesn't. Now, I started off, my focus in high school, well, first year college course that I took was biochemistry. My focus was on the biochemistry side first before I got into all this electrical studies. And I had the same experience. I had my college textbook, and it was about abiogenesis that I was having a real problem with. The idea of life coming from non-life by mere chemical and natural processes under the law of the uniformitarian principle, that the things that we observe today were true in the past, and in which this accounted for all the life that we have and the first life. And so I took great offense by the statements of my textbook that were manifestly false. I took issue with them. I put them into my booklet that I wrote, and I presented that at the end of the course in an independent study on that subject. My teacher had no disagreement with me, but in class he allowed that statement to go unchecked from the text, or these various statements. For example, the Miller-Urey experiments done way back somehow proved that life could be created from non-life. I mean, this is the kind of statements that were being made in the textbook. They actually proved that it could not be. They proved, which I showed, the Racemic mixtures of left and right-hand molecules were the outcome of all amino acids, 50%. And this was very similar to what we're talking here, so don't lose me here. But the amino acids, which are essential building blocks for life, need to be all left-handed. But in natural processes, they're always 50%. If you apply natural processes to creating a sparking event with a mixture of organic materials or inorganic materials that are going to use to become organic, or whatever you want to call it in details, just follow my point here. They became 50%, and they have to be 100% left-handed molecule. That would be like this for you guys. which kind of gives us a illustration between the video and the way you're seeing things, the way I'm showing it, like a mirror effect. But anyway, the point is, the textbook said that flat out. My teacher, who was an anti-creationist, would never bring out that fact that it was a manifest error, that it did not prove that he knew it, and just allowed the students to come to believe that. I pointed that out. It really bothers me, even irrespective of the conclusion of the matter, whether life did come from non-life wasn't the point. The point was it was dishonest to present it. It was dishonest as a teacher to allow it to be not corrected. Whenever I've had a good teacher, they have pointed things out, even against their own theory, you know, and that's the way it should be. But no, it's not the case in the schools. So anyway, I had that experience, and I know what it's like sitting at the college level, and the kids don't really care about the truth. The few that are interested in the field might look into the details a little bit more, but generally they're going to side with what they've heard, because they really can't afford to contradict the system. If they want to get, wanted to get into a PhD, they can't contradict the prevailing theories of things. If they want to, unless it's something that's commercially motivated and a company is paying for it, you know, and all, they want to get a job in their field, and they can't contradict that. So they're going to end up believing what they're taught because they're inclined to do so. They've got motivations. So, so he says all that. He says, why am I showing you this? Now he goes and says it in other words, but I'm going to just summarize what he goes into. Lewin then explains that if you consider a voltmeter in series, right here, like I said, on this side, with the circuit, it is a closed loop, and Kirchhoff's loop rule applies as well as Faraday's. Kirchhoff's rule applies because there is no magnetic flux change in that loop, as I said. But when you consider the voltmeter across the coil only, right? Now we're just considering what's happening on the coil. That's our second box. Then Kirchhoff's loop rule doesn't work, while Faraday's law does. So if you consider the three loops here, there's one loop, there's another loop, and then there's another loop. For those of you who didn't see that there was three loops, those are the three loops there. But they're thinking one-dimensionally, one loop, it's all the same, and they're foggy about the details because they're programmed. The computer chip in their head can only process that. I'm not a programmer. I have to ask my programmer friend how you'd say this properly, but in programming language, the computer cannot go over there because the program hasn't allowed them to go there. There's some kind of language to use for programming that would be very effective if I had that. They can only think one loop. It would be like using the SPICE software, simulation software, without the nonlinear options. You're not going to see the real response in the circuit. So you have to have the nonlinear option. So that, I guess, is a good way of looking at it. Okay, so there are two reasons that people, going back to his quote, there are two reasons that people have religious belief in Kirchhoff's loop rule. One is brainwashed in high school and remembering that. And the other one is that most physics books have it wrong. Again, not Jackson, and I have the link. I'll have the link on there. Classical Electrodynamics, 3rd edition, John David Jackson. And then he goes on, he says, and maybe not Griffiths, but all these college-based physics books that you can buy on the web, every single one has it wrong. They do not understand Faraday's law. Now, I wasn't aware that it was that bad, because in the past he had said that most physics books have it wrong, but the fact that all college physics texts have it wrong, where Jackson and others are advanced stuff that you're not studying in college, that's really concerning, because the masses of people study physics in college. It may not be their major. It may just be one course or something, but they go away, all of them in college. If that's all they do, that's all they know. And that's really critical. Unless they had a teacher like Lewin who dared to say something different, and believe me, if people who were doing that, we'd probably hear more examples of that. That's really concerning to me. That alone, forget even what it's talking about. The fact that you have advanced physics texts higher than the college level, going into great elaborate details about these things, and the college level does not even talk about it. I mean, we're talking about a lot of electrical phenomena here. We're not talking about merely something that happens as a freak of nature, that there's like 1 in a trillion chance of this happening. And that's the way some people portray it. It's something that I do all day long. I mean, that's what I focus on. That's what I engineer. That is what my whole purpose in all of my electrical work is doing. It's all, like even my batteries, it's kind of like a reverse entropy experience. Not that I'm claiming that, but the batteries get better over time. And that's been proven for 12 years now of customers using the chargers to restore thousands upon hundreds of thousands of batteries have been restored. And I don't think people are really denying that anymore. So it's really concerning to me when all the college texts have something that they deliberately say wrong and neglect to focus on at least a passing notice of it, you know. And the same thing really applies to the gains in resonance, which is more advanced topic along these lines. But here we're just talking about a changing magnetic field in a circuit, and not really addressing any resonance in that. So then he's got a video where he says, "My sincere apologies." And you think, oh, well, maybe he's just caving in and just saying, okay, you guys are all right after all, and I was wrong, and I didn't know how to use voltmeter probes. I mean, I went and I bought, you know, a cheap Chinese probe that was 50 cents. When I did my experiment, I didn't realize that there was no resistance in the probe or whatever. I don't know. No, he didn't do that. He said, my apologies, I can't change Faraday's law. I can't do that for you. And it's still there, no matter what you try and deny and make up or skirt the issue. No matter how much you utter the same thing over and over again, it doesn't make it true, right? So he brings up this video in several of these, these videos he brings up this 1982 journal entry from, I don't have the exact magazine or journal, but it's called What Do Voltmeters Measure? Faraday's Law in a multiply connected region by Robert H. Romer, 1982. I've got the link, the PDF. You can look at it. It's short, sweet. I'm going to quote the very beginning, the abstract, and the end, because that's what's important. A long solenoid carrying a varying current produces a time-dependent magnetic field and induces electric fields even in the region exterior to the solenoid, where dB over dt and therefore curl E vanish. By paying attention to A, what is that a voltmeter measures, what is that a voltmeter measures, and B, the simplest properties of line integrals. Example, what circumstances the line integral of E is path independent? Right, for those of you who don't quite get that, it's what I was talking about earlier on. It is easy to use Faraday's law to predict the readings of voltmeters connected to various points in a circuit external to the solenoid. Right? These two predicted meter readings at first seem puzzling and paradoxical. At first. Because you're thinking in terms of Kirchhoff's rule. That's why it seems paradoxical, because that's all you're used to working in. And all the math at the lower level, right? In particular, two identical voltmeters, both connected to the same 2 points in the circuit, will not show identical readings. So reverse from each other, right? These theoretical predictions are confirmed by simple experiments. So this was published in a prestigious journal, and then he ends it, conclusion, of all the phenomena of physics, those associated with Faraday's law are among the most persistently fascinating and puzzling. How is it that dB over dt in one region demands the existence of curl E in that same region, and thus requires the existence of non-vanishing E in other regions in which B and curl E both vanish? In a search of many books and papers on electromagnetic theory, I have been surprised to find little mention of the problem discussed in this paper, though I feel sure it must be known to many other admirers of electromagnetic theory. Now he gives two references. He tells about how, in the next sentence, who brought this to his attention. And so the electromagnetic field by Albert Shadowitz, and I have a link to that. I found the reference that he found on page 348 in that book on Google Books, but it's some book that you have to buy. And then Feynman's Lectures on Physics, Volume 2, AC Circuits 22-2, Enhanced Electronic Version. So those were references that he gave that kind of hint at or indirectly give grounds for. But this was 1982. So if you go and you look, you can find a lot more references that others have pointed out. It's not my, I don't really care about the journals. It's not my interest. The journals have numerous things wrong, stated as if they're gospel truth. And so I'm not going to try and do that. But that's the end of that section of this video, where I don't need to beat it over the head. Most of you understand this, but I wanted you to think in terms of why that is wrong. So I call this anyways the loving open path negative impedance. And so it's negative. It's not in series negative though. It's a parallel, and it can completely negate the positive dissipation, energy dissipated, when you add up the total sum of both energies. And the reason actually a video that I was going to get into was, this is another whole subject matter that will take me a lot more time to do in a video, but I talk about this in my meetings in more detail, and I show how there's a declassified 80-page PDF online on negative differential resistance. And throughout there, the guy continually has to state there is no violation of law, blah, blah, blah. He has to keep on saying that, even like out of context, lest you get the wrong idea that you could possibly have a gain of energy. And so I found another book on Wikipedia that leads you to believe that he's going to show you with an op amp a negative resistance in the way that almost I'm using it, or the way that everybody uses a true negative resistor, true negative impedance. And it really bothered me because as I kind of rushed through the article, he was using all the right terminology, and I was waiting for the punchline, and I actually gave it to one of my engineering friends, and he's like, yeah, Rick, I don't see the point. And I got on the phone, I was like, well, this is really disturbing, because here you have somebody going to all this length of talk, and I said to my friend, I was like, well, there's got to be some kind of justification for the language this guy is using, the magic that's happening here, the unusualness, and that's all descriptive of what we're doing with the batteries, you know, and that's the way we use that terminology. And even Bearden's paper link is quoted at the bottom of this. So I'm just assuming, not in a bad way, just giving the benefit of the doubt, that this guy is going to make the point somewhere. And then when I went back and carefully looked at it, I realized that he is using way too much colorful language to describe something that's not justifying those words. In other words, these are just, you know, if you're talking about an op amp, you're talking about inverting positively and negatively and just balancing out. It's a balancing of amplifier, and it's not doing anything, because in the article though, in the book, he's actually making references to negative differential resistance. So he's saying, well, there's true negative resistance, and then there's negative differential resistance, and the same thing with the impedance. And the thing is, when you read any of these books in physics, you're going to find that these people who believe, like I was saying and pointing out with Kirchhoff's law, a rule, making it a law, they're saying there is no such thing as a true negative resistor. So it really bothered me when people are misleading in that way with these words. They're playing word games, maybe to draw attention to themselves, or maybe indirectly to negate the idea of true negative resistance by saying, oh, well, true negative resistance is just inverted resistance. Like inverted in the sense of below zero, negative charges and positive charges cancel each other out. So it bothers me when people do fakery, and that's, I think, falling under that line. And because I'm dealing with thousands of people all over the world who have had their time and money wasted and their faith destroyed, more or less, in good ideas because of sloppy work that is deliberately sloppy. Now, granted, some people are just mistaken, and that's just part of life, and I don't fault people for being mistaken. We're all mistaken many times in our life, and we need to have grace for such people. But when I see these examples where people are doing that, it really bothers me, and it becomes me to say something about it. Well, I end up doing that and warning people, and that's why I hope that this channel is useful in that way. I'm doing this video, I'm not getting anything from doing this video. I'm merely trying to help people. I'm saving myself a lot of time by making a video that I can tell people, okay, if you, instead of saying the same thing over and over again, it's helping me say it one place. Now you can look at the video and then I don't have to say it again. But I end up talking about these things in various ways with people that are customers and so forth. So let's move on to the second point.